Darci Zollman from the Kosciuszko County Soil and Water Conservation District. I want to talk to you about watersheds a little bit in this activity. So does anyone think they know what a watershed is? And no, it's not a little shed that holds water. So watersheds are land. And it's land that its water drains to a certain body of water. So here at Washington STEM Academy, the school sits in the Tippecanoe River watershed. That means that anytime it rains or the snow melts, that water eventually will flow into the Tippecanoe River. But we know the Tippecanoe River doesn't come to a blunt end, it flows into an even bigger river. It flows into the Wabash River, close to Lafayette. So not only are we in the small Tippecanoe River watershed, we're also in the little bit bigger Wabash River watershed. But the Wabash River doesn't end at a blunt spot either. It flows into an even bigger river, and it flows into the Ohio River. So that means we are in the Tippecanoe, Wabash, and the bigger Ohio River watershed. The Ohio flows into a really big river, and that's the Mississippi. So that means right here, we're also in the really big Mississippi watershed. The Mississippi flows into the Gulf of Mexico. So that's the final destination for the water that starts right here in Kosciuszko County. That means that we're also in the really huge Gulf of Mexico watershed. So why do we need to know that? Well, what that means is whatever we're doing right here has the potential for affecting water quality all the way from here to the Gulf of Mexico. So it's good to know what your watershed address is so you know where your water's going. So how can we define a watershed? Let's do a little demonstration. Inside of your packet, you should have a piece of wax paper. For today, that's going to represent our watershed. Now, I want to point out that watersheds are not nice and square. They follow very curvy lines. So the things that define a watershed is topography, or how high and low the land is. But for our purposes today, we're going to use a square piece of wax paper. So the first thing I'd like you to do is take your dropper and get a little water in it, and just put some drops on your wax paper. Okay, do you see how the water just sits there? So water in a watershed sometimes sits very still and soaks into the ground. But most watersheds are not flat. So let's manipulate our paper just a little bit. Let's change things up. So I'm going to wipe the drops off. Next, I want you to put a fold in your paper. We're going to make a little mountain here. And see if you can make that stand up a little bit. Okay? This is more like a watershed. So topography is differences in elevation or height of the land. So this time, I want you to put some drops, kind of put it across the edge of your watershed and see which way it flows. If you're really good, you can split a drop so that part of the water goes on either side. So water that flowed on one side of our paper represents water flowing into this watershed. Water that flowed on the other side put it in a totally different watershed. So these areas of high elevation are the things that help divide one watershed from another. But you know, not all watersheds have nice straight lines either. So we're going to make some more changes. So again, wipe the drops off. So this time, I want you to take your wax paper and just kind of gently crumble it up. That's more what a watershed really looks like. There's areas of high elevation, low elevation, and a lot of curves in between. This time, take your drops and just kind of drop them around your watershed. Try to notice where that water flows and how it moves. Does your water move in a channel? That might represent a river or a stream. Does it kind of pool in a place or gather in a place? That might represent a pond or a lake. So watersheds are areas of different heights in the landscape, and water moves very differently through different parts depending on the topography. So when you're talking about watersheds, it's a good thing to know what your watershed address is. That's where you live, and it tells you where your water is going to flow. That way you know which water you're impacting with all of your activities. Knowing your watershed address is important for us that work in the water quality field because it helps us know how to protect our water the best way. So, look on a map, see if you can find your watershed address and where your water flows. I want to talk to you a little bit more about watersheds today and how you can tell which watershed is which. When we do that, we call that delineating a watershed, figuring out which watershed water is moving in. So you're going to use some maps today to help you do that. So the first thing I want to show is a map of the United States. This map shows some of our larger watersheds in our country. So for this map, we're in the Ohio watershed. So see if you can find Indiana on this map. For the next part of our activity, we're going to have you decide how those lines are delineated in a couple of examples of some watersheds. So here's a picture of a watershed. When we draw lines to delineate a watershed, they're often connecting the dots of high elevation, or the highest points. The highest points are often at the ends of small streams or tributaries flowing into a bigger body of water. So for this activity, pull out your sheet 195. You'll see a big dot at the bottom on the left-hand corner that says Start, way over here. So we're going to connect the dots. The dots should be at the ends of all those tributaries leading into the bigger body of water. So you'll start here and make a big loop with your pencil and connect the dots and go to the finished dot. See if you can do that. How did you do with that activity? Does your picture look a lot like this one? If so, you've done a really good job of delineating this watershed. So for the next part of this activity, you're going to delineate several watersheds. So watersheds often carry the name of the big body of water that the water is flowing to. For example, again, the water here at Washington STEM Academy flows into the Tippecanoe River. So we're in the Tippecanoe River watershed. So for this activity, you're going to have 4 watersheds. The big rivers in this activity all have different colored names. So take your colored pencils or crayons and color in each color of the river on this example. Then I want you to delineate or draw those lines or connect the dots like you did with the first one, and see if you can delineate each of these colored watersheds from each other. So see how you do with this part. So did you finish that activity? So does your map look a lot like this one? If so, you've done another good job of delineating one watershed from the other.